Hello, fellow money nerds. I'm Tanja Hester, and I'm so excited to be back with you for another Big Idea Talk at FinCon. I'd love to hear from you during today's session, so please send your questions and comments my way on Twitter. I'll leave my handle up the whole time. It's at @our_nextlife. Before retiring early 3 years ago, I spent my career in politics and journalism, two fields that require you to talk about difficult and often polarizing subjects, but hopefully in ways that people will actually hear and not just tune them out. Through that work and my work in personal finance, I've learned that there's tremendous benefit to talking about hard subjects, especially those topics that scare you, that make you feel like you're not well equipped enough to talk about them, or you're going to get criticized too much if you talk about them, you're going to step in it. But there's huge benefit, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start out first with a question. Is it your goal with your content to help everyone, or to help only those who are already doing better than average? I can't see you, but I assume most of you answered that you want to help everyone, or at least not only those who are already doing pretty well. And that is the perfect place to begin this conversation, because ultimately, tackling hard topics is about being more inclusive and bringing more people in as your audience. So let's talk about why we should tackle scary topics. When I first started my blog, Our Next Life, 6 years ago, I was completely anonymous. And it sounds a bit ridiculous to say it now, but I didn't even share whether I was a man or a woman. Eventually, though, that got awkward, and I revealed on the blog that I'm a woman. Here I am. I'll never forget one of the first long emails I got from a reader. In it, she shared that it meant so much to her to hear from a woman in the personal finance space, particularly in financial independence and retire early, the FIRE space, because back then it was mostly men writing about it. She knew almost nothing about me, but just the fact that I was a woman like her gave her this connection. And that was a small aha, but it gave me an important aha at that point of thinking, how many people am I failing to engage because they don't know who I am? They don't understand where I'm coming from, what my beliefs are driven by, what the money things I write about are driven by. So I started to share more. I started to get more personal about my health challenges that motivated my journey to early retirement. I started talking about growing up with a single disabled parent, and I started talking more about my worldview, which is the belief, as JFK said, for those to whom much is given, much is required. It wasn't especially fun or easy to write those things. Every time I'd write a post that got more into my personal beliefs or the scary subjects, I would sweat it. But eventually, I realized that it really felt good because I was hearing from more readers. I was hearing from folks who suddenly felt welcome in the blog, in the FIRE community, and it felt good enough to overcome any of that negative emotion I had, any of that fear. But my biggest aha moment came when I revealed our identities on the blog and I shared that we live in California. I wrote a post about why that is, about why we live in California, why we plan to stay here. And for background, we live very close to the Nevada border, and Nevada is a state with no income tax. And a lot of readers just could not fathom why we would choose to stay in California, even though I had given a whole list in my post. And I finally just said, you know what? We are not trying to pay as little as possible in taxes. We believe in the things that taxes pay for. Of course, some folks didn't like that answer, and that's fine. But what was really incredible is how many people I heard from after writing that, even though it had been to me just a throwaway line that I shared out of exasperation, frankly. I heard from people who said, before this, I thought that everyone in personal finance was selfish, and I felt like I couldn't relate to that. And now hearing this, I wonder how many people actually share my values. There were a lot of emails along those lines. I realized that sharing something that felt a little more political, in fact, had huge power because it let a lot more readers see themselves in my blog, see themselves in the FIRE community, and maybe start to open their minds a little bit about what was here for them rather than just tuning it all out because of assumptions they'd made because others weren't sharing political statements. That was the aha moment I needed to start writing about more topics that had previously felt off limits. I started writing more about healthcare, about opportunity gaps that put FIRE out of reach for a lot of folks. and eventually about how the personal finance sphere upholds systemic racism and how those pursuing FIRE often do so at the expense of others. I didn't lose my fear all at once. It took time. It took practice. It took, frankly, getting uncomfortable comments and emails back that were really critical and saying, you know what? I can get notes like this and still be okay. I can keep going. That's something that I had to thicken my skin to understand. And now I can't imagine not talking about healthcare, about opportunity gaps, about motherhood penalties, about why healthcare should be a right and not a privilege. Learning to talk about scary subjects is incredibly freeing. But it's not just good for you, it's also good for building your audience. Thinking across all the readers I mentioned who I heard from, there's something every single one of them had in common. It was that they felt a connection to my work when they felt seen, when they felt like I understood something about their lives, something about the barriers they face, or maybe just I shared their values. Values are something we don't talk enough about. It can feel scary to do that, but I really encourage you to go there, to share with readers who you are, where your belief system comes from, what informs the financial advice you give. If you saw my talk last year, you might remember me saying that psychologists rank the desire to feel understood above the desire for happiness. If you haven't seen the talk, I'd love for you to go watch it. It's on the FinCon YouTube channel and on my YouTube channel, but I'll repeat the important point from it. Psychologists rank the desire to feel understood above the desire for happiness. That makes it one of our most important desires. We filter all information we receive through that lens. We decide whether advice we see applies to us based on whether we think that author or that speaker understands our life, understands our values, understands who we are. If we feel like they don't, we leave and we might be lost forever. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that life is hard for a lot of people. It's not always possible to save an emergency fund if you've lost your job and no one is hiring. You can't start investing if you can't pay your rent and another stimulus check is nowhere in sight. Life has always been hard for a huge number of people, especially in the US, but this pandemic and recession have only made that more true. So our readers really, really need us to step up. They need us to talk about things in a way that will show that we understand their lives. We understand the barriers they're up against. We understand the things that they find important. They need that guidance in a way that they can hear and feel included in. I know it can feel scary to talk about things beyond the control of the individual. It's natural to worry about what will happen if you take on a subject that's politically controversial, not wanting to step in it. We have this false idea that we might get canceled if we say something controversial, when really what often nets that harsh criticism is doubling down on something after folks have attempted to educate you and show you that what you said was wrong. Just learn, acknowledge your mistake, and move on. That's far safer. But here's a huge piece of good news. If you know how to talk about money, you already know how to talk about something super, super scary. The vast majority of people say that talking about money scares them. They say they'd rather talk about anything else, politics, religion, you name it. And so here you are, out here talking about money like it's no big thing. You already know how to have hard conversations about hard topics that could feel controversial. It's just that in personal finance, we've normalized that. We have made it no big thing to talk about money. So it's not about building a new skill set. It's simply about taking skills you already have and applying them to a broader set of topics. It's about normalizing talking about maybe some political things, otherwise just some things that have to do with reality, into the way we talk about money. You can do that. So let's talk about how. The first thing you can do is start with the micro if the macro scares you. In the age of greater visibility of police brutality and the resulting Black Lives Matter protests, it can feel like you have to be able to cite every detail of the murder of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery by the police in order to even touch issues of race in personal finance. But you don't. You can talk about the racial wealth gap, the racial earnings gap, discrimination against people of color in the workplace, as their own topics, or even as an example to get more specific, let's say you're a teacher and you write about education. You could talk about the pay gap between Black women teachers and white women teachers. That's a whole topic all by itself. You can get as narrow as you need to. So give yourself permission to talk about things that feel charged and loaded without having to talk about the whole big thing. Your readers know the context and they want to see you touching things that touch their lives. They don't expect you to be an expert in racial justice. Next, get out of your echo chamber and truly listen. For most of my time in personal finance, my frame of reference has been the FIRE community. It's been the blogs that I read, the people on Twitter I followed. And if I had just stayed in that bubble of only hearing from folks pursuing or who've already achieved early retirement, I might very quickly come to the false belief that everyone could do this, or at least most people could. I might think everyone could save half their income, everyone could retire in their 40s or 50s. But of course, the data tell a very different story. They tell us that most people struggle to cover basic expenses. They tell us that most people can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment in an American city. So we know that the real world is very different from my little FIRE echo chamber. So it's really important that you make an effort to follow bloggers, people, folks out in the world who have a different worldview than you, who have different earnings, different skin color, different gender and sexual orientation, that you follow economics news and not just personal finance news, so that you understand the full economic picture and what truly most people are up against. That will lead you to give far better advice to your readers because it's coming from a much more informed and empathetic place. Next, assume that your experience is not universal or even the norm. An incredibly common phrase in personal finance, and one that I can't stand, is if I could do it, so can you. If it was up to me, it's not, sadly, but if it was up to me, I would forever banish that phrase from our vocabularies, because the truth is that none of us know what's possible for someone else. There are billions of people on the planet, and you've had the experience of one of them. I've had the experience of one of them. That's an infinitesimally small fraction of perspectives that we're privy to. And so rather than assuming that just because I had some circumstances that did something, that means other people could, which could unintentionally shame them if they can't achieve what you achieved, share the circumstances that let you do what you did, your big thing, paying off debt, retiring early, saving an emergency fund, changing careers. Share those circumstances and then let readers draw their own conclusion about what's possible for them. But once you assume that your perspective, your experience are not universal or even the norm, it opens you up so much more to listening, to being empathetic, so that you truly can hear from folks who will tell you, hey, this wasn't possible for me, but here's what is possible. And that's going to lead you to give far better advice. Next, and similarly, come at your content creation from a place of curiosity, not expertise. The best mindset to adopt, especially when exploring scary subjects, is the one of the non-expert. If you remember my talk from last year, I talked about how readers may see you as an expert even if you do not present yourself as one. And so I highly recommend presenting yourself as a real person and sharing the whole mess of you rather than just showing this facade of perfection that no one can relate to. But here, when we're talking about scary topics, that applies even more. If you go into it saying that you have all the answers and that you're going to shout down from on high, you're much more likely to come across as arrogant and strident and unyielding, unwilling to listen, than you are if you come to that scary topic from a place of curiosity, of saying, here's how I've been thinking about it, but now I'm seeing maybe I should think about it this way because I learned X, Y, and Z. And so here's kind of where I'm headed. What do you think of that? Bringing questions into it, both for yourself as the writer and to your readers, your audiences, to help them come into the conversation and say, I never thought about it that way. Or here's something you may not have thought of, writer, that can continue to revise your views. But making it more of a conversation driven by curiosity rather than by a desire to demonstrate your firm expertise is going to bring people in much more and give you a lot of latitude to talk about controversial things because you're not claiming to have all the answers. You're just interested in the topic because people are talking about it, people are thinking about it. It's relevant to readers' lives. Next, Learn to discern between political and politicized. There's a common political conversation that happens all the time in personal finance, but that we don't see as political. It's taxes, specifically how much you pay and how you can try to pay less than you otherwise might. That's actually a right-leaning political position, but we don't talk about it as a political topic. It doesn't feel loaded because we've normalized that topic. We've broken the taboo on it. On the other hand, you've got something like healthcare that's actually not political at all because the vast, vast majority of people believe that everyone should be able to go to the doctor, whether you can afford it or not. So it's not political, but it's been highly politicized. And if you talk about the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, you might have someone tell you that you're trying to take us to communist Cuba or communist China, when in fact you just want people to be able to go see the doctor. We've seen this happen in real time this year, the process of politicizing something with masks. It was a public health recommendation from virtually every expert and doctor that we just wear masks out in public, very sensible, but it quickly became a test of ideological alignment, whether you wanted to wear one or not. Folks on the left tend to wear them, folks on the right are much less likely to. Again, something not political. It's just a public health measure like washing your hands, but it became politicized. So the reason we want to know the difference is because things that are not political but are politicized are really important to talk about. They're things where your readers and listeners are going to tend to agree. They want to be able to go to the doctor, for example, but we tend not to talk about those things because they feel scary and loaded because they've been politicized. So if you can find the courage and you can step up and you can talk about those things that are not political but are politicized, you will be doing your audience a great service because most people out there are afraid to talk about this stuff. Next, when all else fails, use stats. You're always on solid ground when you can back up what you're saying with solid evidence from reputable, nonpartisan sources. So whether it's that you need confidence to broach a topic that feels scary, or you want to be able to head off any criticism you might receive, people who might disagree with your argument, use data. Maybe it's showing a few charts to show the wage gap or the increasing jobless rate during the recession, talking about how much harder it is for students to pay off student loans today than it was 20 years ago, or how much harder it is for Gen X and Gen Z to buy a home than it was for baby boomers. That is a great story to tell with data that will also help your readers and audiences feel seen because they'll say, okay, well, that's why it's harder for me, not because I'm a personal failure. So bring that data in, especially if it's from big economic sources and not just personal finance sources, so that, again, you're telling a fuller picture, you're helping yourself feel like you're more solid in making the argument you're making, and you'll help more of your audience feel seen. And finally, expect it to go well. When we come to something from a place of worry or anxiety, it's easy to assume the worst, to plan for everyone's going to hate me, no one's going to like my argument, I'm going to lose all my audience if I go there, if I talk about this thing. But what if instead we do the opposite? What if we say, hey, almost nobody's talking about this because it feels scary and complex. And so in talking about it, I'm doing a big service to my readers. I'm going to help them get information that others are not helping them get. I'm going to help them learn a new perspective that others aren't providing for them. And that is a good thing. People will be grateful for that, even if they disagree. Sometimes people disagree initially and they might tell you so loudly, but then they quickly come around after they've had a little time to think about it. So disagreement itself is not a bad outcome. What is a good outcome is people feeling seen and, again, maybe changing some perspectives. When I've written my most controversial posts, the ones where I've been most anxious about hitting publish, that's where I've actually gotten the most positive feedback of all. So I'm offering that to you to provide a little bit of extra courage, a little extra nudge to go out there and talk about some of these hard and scary topics. So those are my very best tips for freeing yourself to talk about scary subjects, including the political ones, and for helping your audience feel included and seen. If I've said anything in this talk that's inspired you, write it down now. Don't wait for the next session to begin where your mind goes elsewhere or for that thought to leave your brain. Write it down. If you've had a tough topic kicking around in your brain for a while, but you've been a little too timid to actually write it or talk about it, consider this your nudge. You can do it. I believe in you. Talking about hard things gets easier with practice, and the only way you get that practice is if you do it. There's no better way to build an audience than by offering something different from what everybody else is doing. And talking about the things that others are too afraid to talk about is the best way to set yourself apart in an instant. So you can do this. It's freeing for you. It's good for building your audience. Please go for it and share with me what you write. I can't wait to see it. Until then, have a great FinCon. Bye guys. Thank you.